So I know we have those two things about judging a leader and judging a democracy, but I think those can be very greatly simplified. So points one and two of the leadership thing about being able to listen to others and accept criticism, those are essentially the same. So we're just going to group those together. Points three and five about respecting other people around you and having a transparent vision are necessary to have one and two, right? You can't listen to other people if you don't respect them, and you can't respect people around you if you don't trust them. And transparency is a huge way of showing your trust towards people. So one, two, three, and five can always just be grouped together into essentially just having an open mind and listening to other people's opinions and being able to change. And points four, six, and seven are all essentially just talking about being a decisive leader and being able to get stuff done and make decisions. So those are the two main criteria about judging a leader. And then there's two main criteria about judging a democracy. So having a good balance between freedom and order can be directly reflected in consent of the governed, because a consent of the governed essentially is a way to measure how well a leader is achieving, about how well a democracy is achieving those two. And then civic virtue is just civic virtue. So let's look at Jackson at both as a leader and for a democracy. So he was a horrible leader, but he was actually pretty good for democracy. So he was a horrible leader. Let's talk about that. So the way that he treats his spoil system and his kitchen cabinet means that he surrounds himself with people who agree with him and who are completely incompetent at their jobs. And he does this, I think, on purpose, because if you look at how the European monarchs treated their nobility, right? Basically, they just got them all caught up in court intrigue and made them incompetent at what they are, in order for them to have all the power. And that's what Jackson does. He himself has all of the power. So he's terrible at listening to other people. And if you look at what happened to Calhoun, who he split off from, later, a few years after kicking him off the ticket, he straight up threatens to hang him himself. That means that he's pretty bad at taking criticism. And well, yeah, he did listen to his voters. He himself agreed with his voters. So that doesn't really count towards listening to other people. So let's look at how well he was at being an effective and decisive leader. And yeah, he is very decisive, right? Even from his beginnings as a military commander, because he is a war hero. That's how he gets his fame and popularity, by being a war hero. Uh, so so that requires a decisive action in a crucial amount of time. That's how people become war heroes. And the fact that he threatened to personally hang Calhoun shows that he has lots of decisiveness in him and he's willing to take action. And the fact that he's the one and only president in US history to veto the bank also shows something about how much he's willing to enforce what he believes. But is this effective? And the answer is no, because he's completely unable to look into the future and think in the long term. So a huge portion of his presidency is dictated by how he treats the bank and his vetoing of the national bank, right? So on paper, it's not completely unjustified. The foreclosure of the Western banks and the land panic of 1819 all mean that everybody thinks that the national bank is bad for the economy. So he gets rid of it. So this ends up creating land panic because of species circular. And so because the wildcat banks have to take over all of that demand for loans, which essentially just means that there's a lot of garbage money that has no worth to it, a lot like cryptocurrency. But sorry. Uh, so so he enforces species circular, which means that you can only take a loan on land using gold and silver. So this drives up prices, which causes the land panic of 1837. So by trying to prevent the land panic of 1819, he ends up creating the land panic of 1837, which shows that he was horrible in that aspect. And if you look at the way that he handled nullification, it almost came down to an outright civil war. So that shows that he wasn't very effective at keeping the nation together. But we'll talk about that later on. So essentially, yeah, he is a horrible leader because he does not achieve that balance between being a decisive leader and being able to listen to other people. He just listens to himself. And all of this could have been prevented if he listened to the people who told him why this was a bad idea. And again, uh, looking at the military, right? There's only one goal, to kill the enemy. But in the presidency, there's multiple goals. So Jackson failed at having those multiple goals and had a balance and was therefore a bad leader. Next, let's look at how he was good for democracy. So civic virtue and consent of the governed. Well, yeah, the nullification crisis and the forcible came under Jackson. It was all started under the Tariff Abominations, which was started by Madison. And you can't really blame Jackson for that, right? Because South Carolina threatens to secede, no president is going to just let any state they want secede, especially not one as economically important as South Carolina. And after he left, he still remained very popular. Right? His vice president became the president to succeed him. And things such as Native American removal, abolishing the national bank, establishing a much more laissez-faire economy, expanding voting rights to poor white men, meant that he was, again, very popular and had the consent of the governed, which shows that he didn't let the nation fall apart under his watch, and he was very popular, which meant that he struck a good balance and therefore had good consent of the government and was therefore good for democracy. And he himself does embody a lot of the core values of America, being able to go from a dirt poor person in Tennessee to being the president of the United States. That's the American dream, and the belief that we should constantly expand and manifest destiny. And that's always been there from day one of America. So he does embody American virtues like that and value the common man over the elites. That's a huge thing about what he runs on. Like by expanding the voting rights of the people, he embodies core American values. Uh, but again, so all that shows that he embodies American values and that he has the consent of the governed, and therefore, by this criteria, he is his Jacksonian democracy is a good democracy. So, but so what, right? So, what are the huge takeaways? A large portion of his presidency boils down to elites versus common people. And who do we listen to? Do we listen to the people actually experience it, or do we listen to the people who've learned it? And especially in modern day politics. And going back to order versus liberty, right? Cryptocurrency is probably going to be the new wildcat banks. So it's going to be interesting about how the Federal Reserve is going to deal with cryptocurrency and how they're going to regulate it. And then also the way that land prices are going at the moment, it essentially means that there will be a land panic soon. And like, is this preventable? And or is this just an inevitable facet of the economy? And also a big part is the role of big banks and big businesses in the American economy. Again, those huge tech companies, they all trace their origins back to Rockefeller and industrialization. Industrialization would not be possible without Jackson actively promoting the laissez-faire economy. So this will be very important for industrialization. And again, it's about what he embodies. Jackson embodies the spirit of America in a lot of ways, about being able to rise from the poorest of the poor to the richest of the rich. And basically, he's a reflection on America and about constantly expanding, right? Like we're thinking about putting people on the moon and expanding into space. And again, so Jacksonian democracy and Jackson himself is a huge representation about what America can be and essentially what we should and should not do. So it's again, it's a learning point about what we should and should not do in a democracy.